Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's video, which is on help. So, ordinarily in these videos, we look at what specifically constitutes a first pressing. However, I do need to caveat this video with a warning that help, or at least in my experience, help is a bit of a funny one. And the reason it is unusual is because I've seen 3 or 4 different interpretations of what is a first pressing. Some people think it's one thing, others another, some a mixture of the two. I know this all sounds very confusing and isn't quite the spirit of the concise video I hope to make on each Beatles album, but I'll show you the variations and I'll explain my thoughts on them. Okay, now I feel I should begin by pointing out that you can find 60s copies of Help, early copies that is, in one of 2 fonts, either the Times New Roman or the sans serif fonts. Now, this is a copy with the Times New Roman font, which is long and thin and tall. You'll see the other font in a moment, so you can compare them. But anyway, this is the version that I see most people, or the majority of people, call a first pressing. So that's side 1. And here's side 2. Just a few things to point out. Sold in the UK text, you must look for that, because if it doesn't have that, then it's a later copy. And it'll start with the Gramophone Company Limited on the perimeter text. Now, this is the label I was just showing to you. And this is a very similar label, which also has the Times New Roman font. However, there is a subtle difference. There's actually more than one subtle difference, but the biggest one is the Beatles here is larger than it is here. And you'll also notice that it has Northern Songs NCB here and not here, and that there are wider gaps between the lines here than on here. So that's an example of the very subtle differences you can get between these variations. Now, this is an example of the sans serif font. Now, the label has a few scratches, but hopefully you can ignore those. And the sans serif font, as you can see, is smaller, slightly chunkier. And also, although it does have the same sold in the UK and the Gramophone Company Limited, the P1965 on this particular version is right up close to the XEX.549. Now, I've got a couple of other versions of this, which I'll show in a moment, where that P1965 will change position. Now, actually, this version here is the one I always used to call the first pressing, and in the Beatles on Parlophone Records book by Frank Daniels and Bruce Spicer, that also calls this and the Times New Roman one first pressings, both of them. However, I have seen people call this one a second pressing as well, so this is where it really does get complicated with the Help album, because people seem to have very different views for some reason. Now, this is, as I mentioned, largely the same, except you'll notice the main difference is the P1965 is now further down. There's a much bigger gap between that and the XEX.549. And the same is true of side 2, as you can see there. And there are, similar superficial differences in terms of the spacing with these albums, but that's the easiest thing to spot. You don't need a magnifying glass to spot that. So that's the second version. I do actually have a third, just here. And you'll notice here that the P1965 is, again, spaced slightly differently. It's actually straighter and more in line with the XEX, whereas previously it was drifting off here somewhere. And there's side 2. Okay, so we now turn to the stereo versions of Help. Now, the same is true in terms of some people considering individual variations to be pressings in their own right, and some people considering them just to be variations on the first pressing. But we'll begin with the Times New Roman version. Now, you can tell this is a stereo copy because it has a nice big stereo designation in the top right corner, so you can't miss that. And there's side 2. And here is a nice example of the sans serif version. So as you can see, completely different font. And the stereo designation is in the same place, but it's smaller. And there's side 2 there. And I do have one little variation of this here. So it's very, very similar, except similar to the mono variation actually. The P1965 has just come down a bit. But other than that, it's very, very similar. Alright, so I feel as though I should apologise for not coming to such a definite conclusion in this video about what constitutes a first pressing. However, I think it's only fitting that I try to answer my own question. Is it the first? Well, I think it really depends on which source you trust the most. Now, if you have read the book Beatles for Sale on Parlophone Records by Frank Daniels and Bruce Spicer, which I think is a very accurate guide, they basically say that every single copy of Help I've shown in this video is a variation of a first pressing. So all those mono copies are variations of a first pressing, and all those stereos are variations of a stereo first pressing. Whereas some collectors I've seen and some websites, which themselves do seem trustworthy, they treat each variation, or perhaps not quite each variation, but many of these variations with the different fonts as being different pressings in their own right. So it really is, I don't like to use the word subjective, but it really is about which source you trust the most. But I hope this has at least shed some light on whether your copy of Help is a first or not. And I would just like to say, if your copy does not have the sold in the UK text, then it is, but it is on the yellow and black label, then it's a 1969 pressing, and that is a clear reissue. But anyway, that's really it from me. I don't want to ramble on for too long, so thank you so much, and I hope to see you all next time.